to the things that are not captured by those dominant ways of seeing politics within academic research and the ways that knowledge is utilised in government and public administration. So what I try and do is come at questions of politics, whether that's in terms of migration or climate change or regionalism, from the perspective of culture, from the perspective of creative practice, of art, of literature, in a way to try and think differently about the way that people experience the political world, but also to try and find different ways to think about policy frameworks, about processes for resolving conflict and ways to get along better, both with each other, but also with our environments.
That's amazing. Yeah, I mean, like, I think it's very important for us to learn because our work in the ministry, spans across our nation, and we connect and we have projects with people from local governments as well as international partners. We have our priorities, perhaps they're not always aligned. Maybe how do we communicate that? How do we align them to to serve our best interest? Okay, so I think that's a good introduction. I will offer the floor to you to do your presentation.
Thank you very much. Would you like me to sit or stand?
Please do.
I'm happy to sit. It's been a long day.
Sure.
Thank you. So I think I have some slides. Can we get those up? Wonderful. Thank you. There's my email address if anyone would like to contact me afterwards. So yeah, the topic of today's talk is intercultural communication, global crisis and regional futures. And that's, I think, probably an overly ambitious and lofty topic. So I don't want to overpromise and underdeliver. So I'm just going to try and moderate expectations and say that these are touch points that I'll be speaking about, and I'm hoping just to offer some provocations rather than answers. Hopefully plant some new questions in your minds that you can take with you through your work. Next slide, please. Before I go any further, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which I live and work. For those of you who have visited Australia, you may have heard such an acknowledgement before public events. This is something that we at Griffith University like to do in order to remind ourselves that the work of reconciliation is incomplete, and also to acknowledge the tremendous contributions that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have made and continue to make to society and to culture and to knowledge. So I pay my respect to the Jagera and Turrbal people of Southeast Queensland, and pay my respect to their elders past and present, and acknowledge that their lands were never ceded. I also am very honoured and humbled to be able to contribute to the tens of thousands of years old traditions of learning and teaching on the country on which I live. Next slide, please. So I've given that little bit of history previously about myself and the way that I approach the study of politics and various related issues. My work at Griffith University has two parts, or I wear two hats. One of them is as Director International for the Arts, Education and Law faculty. And in that role, I represent 7 academic schools and several research centres. They include my own school, my home school of the School of Humanities, Languages and Social Science, but also cover a whole range of different academic disciplines and programs, from law to film and visual arts to criminology and education. So I work with and represent I would say dozens of academic disciplines within the faculty, which makes my work very enriching and very challenging. But it also allows me to constantly think about the connections between different parts of our university and the new forms of collaboration that can emerge from thinking critically and creatively about uh, knowledge production, both in academic research and also in teaching. And I've been at Griffith for 10 years, having first been appointed as a much younger lecturer 10 years ago. The photo that was in the opening slide is a bit closer to that time than right now. So I had more hair and more colour in my beard. Before I started at Griffith, I spent a short period at Monash University teaching in international relations and political science. And as I mentioned previously, I have degrees in um, political science, international relations, peace and conflict studies, and theatre. In addition to that broad approach to studying politics, my specific interest areas are also quite diverse. I've done the majority of my academic work on the politics of migration and mobility, trying to understand the political systems that govern the way that people move and the ways that mobile people shape societies, and thinking about those two processes in relation to each other. And that work I've explored border security policies in Australia, climate change governance in the Pacific Island region, also looked at migration politics in North America and South Africa. I'm also, as I said, broader interests in development, thinking about the interactions and intersections between local experiences of development and global processes. I'm more recently interested in the ways that various infrastructures intersect with society. I'm currently working on a project that's exploring the impacts of militarization and development on Indigenous communities in Australia. And I could speak about other things that I'm talking about, but I think we don't have that much time. So I might go to the next slide, please. So today I want to make 3 points. And as I said, they're not conclusive arguments, they are provocations. And to help us to perhaps think a little bit differently about communication and its role in the world, but also in the work that we do in the world. I want to address this idea of crisis and how we can think about crisis a little bit more expansively rather than just focusing on discrete issues. And then I want to think about the region as a framework for thinking about future possibilities. Next slide, please. So, communication. Now, I will preface what I'm about to say with the admission that I am not a communications scholar per se. As I've said, I'm a political scientist. But in my work, both my theoretical work, but also the work that I do meeting people and exploring political issues in various contexts, I've come to the realization that intercultural communication is not a discrete or separate or specialized part of communication practice. We often think about it as something that, requires, highly technical skills, specialist bodies of knowledge, and so forth to be done effectively. But I want to address intercultural communication in a slightly different way here and think about intercultural communication as communication. Now, yes, that might seem obvious, but what I'm suggesting here is that we live in what I would describe we are living in a planetary age, okay? Whereas previously, in various, times in human history, we might have described ourselves in relation to others, ourselves in relation to the world in different ways. Through prior to European colonization, for example, societies may have had connections across difference, but were by and large highly localized. Through the period of European expansion and formal colonization, that also came with the development of world economic systems, forms of extraction, exploitation, and exchange that unequally benefited certain peoples at the expense of others. But through the creation of those economic systems, the frameworks or infrastructures for connection across difference, across time, across space were forged. So we can think about empire and colonization as also connecting the world in a particular way. For most people, most societies, it wasn't a good way, but that's part of our shared history. Throughout the 20th century, we've become much more integrated through what is often described as globalization, the deepening and stretching of connections across time and space, the weakening of national borders as the determining structural factor shaping our lives. The expansion of trade networks, of finance, of commerce, the rise of the internet, the rise of mass travel. All of these things have forged these incredibly complex connections across the world. And so perhaps we could say throughout the 20th century, we became, global creatures. We've all become globalized, and again, unequally positioned within global systems, and benefiting unequally through those. But those connections are being formed. Now, when we speak about a planetary age, we can also, introduce the idea that that anthropogenic climate change is refashioning, changing, intensifying the connections that we share with each other and with the planet. So what I want to suggest here is that in all of that mixing and that connection and that integration that has been happening over a long period of time, it no longer makes sense to talk discreetly or in a specialist way about intercultural communication because we've all become intercultural in really important ways. They may not be obvious ways, and they may not always have salience. They might not be the most important thing we think about in our daily lives. But the fact that we're all connected on social media, we carry around phones, we have phones that are made from components built in factories across this region, that those components are made from the primary materials that we extract from local environments. And these commodities circulate constantly around the world. These forge connections. There's always those cultural connections there. So the challenge of communication is that of negotiating all of these complex and oftentimes minute differences in our daily work and our daily lives. And so what I want to suggest here is that when we're talking about the challenge of communicating across difference, whether that's communicating different values, trying to convey positive messages, or even just trying to listen about what is affecting people, trying to communicate an understanding of the public good or the national interest. We need to think about communication as not just the transmission of packets of information. I'm communicating to you, you communicate with me, but as a way that deeper conceptions of culture and belonging and identity and sorry, I'm going to use a pretentious academic word here, ontology, ways of understanding the world are constantly brought into conversation with each other. And if we don't pay attention to those dynamics, as well as the message that we want to convey or the message we want to receive, then I think that we're going to constantly fail to communicate well across difference, especially when that difference is not just about different material interests. We build this mine here instead of there. We look after this part of the environment and sacrifice this one. But also trying to understand why it is the cultural and ideational structures that that give meaning to people's lives and the relationships they have with each other. So the point here is that communication is not just a technical problem. It's also, and again, I'm sorry, I'm an academic. I can't help it. It's also epistemological. It has to do with knowledge, right? We have to also pay attention to the fact that communicating across cultural difference also entails trying to translate knowledge systems uh, into each other. And if we don't pay attention to that, then I think we're always going to fail to find commonalities and common purpose. And related to this challenge is the danger, I think, of constantly or only relying on certain ways of knowing the world to inform our decision making and to inform our communication practices. So and I'm going to speak in very broad generalizations here. For much of the 20th century, ideas about development and social change were guided primarily by a very narrow way of seeing the world and understanding the world. And we might think about these as what senior development scholars have called the development episteme, right? Structures of knowledge, largely drawing on the positivist social sciences like economics, comparative politics, area studies, and so forth, to make claims about how the world works and how the world could work better. A nice example of this way of thinking is a very famous text by an economist, a mid-century economist called Walt Rostow. You may have heard of it. It's Theory of Modernization. So Walt Rostow talked about, or in his book, wrote about his theory of modernization, the way that nations go from what he described as traditional society all the way up to what he described as high mass consumption. Now, it's a really, interesting narrative, a really interesting analysis of how um, societies go about processes of industrialization and modernization of the state and the reorganization of the economy and so on and so forth. But one important limitation of this theory, modernization theory, is that it presumes that the experiences of one nation state, North America or the United States, can be generalized across all nation states, including those that won their hard-fought independence throughout the 20th century. Um, so the point here is that that idea about modernization became very influential, right? It was then exported to, um, you know, existing and newly decolonized nations as the blueprint for development. Now, of course, that idea of development misses the fact that, Western industrialization was only possible through the exploitation of the colonial or the colonized periphery. And, there are many other methodological flaws, but um, what has tended to happen is that these assumptions get reproduced in knowledge, right? So then we look at, um, you know, and fast forwarding to today, where we might have more sophisticated forms of analysis, we can also point to some limitations in that analysis. So if we rely exclusively on, econometric analysis to tell us a story about sustainable development, we're going to miss the human experience because by its very nature, national level econometric analysis abstracts from the human experience and takes the nation as the unit of reference for the analysis. That little digression points to the challenges imposed by what I'm calling siloed thinking, right? Thinking only in terms of bounded categories of knowledge. And so addressing the problem of intercultural communication, I also encourage you to think about what other forms of knowledge can we draw into our work and draw into the task of communicating across difference. And particularly for those in the room, you all are doing really important work, working for a public ministry charged with supporting the distribution and production of energy and natural resources. These are fundamental to public life. So I think it's really important to consider what other kinds of knowledge we can bring to the table. Next slide, please. Okay, so we do, I think, live in an age of overlapping and intensifying global crises. Uh, it feels like there's a new crisis almost every day. But certainly the overarching issues that we face, the collective issues that we face are producing crises in themselves. So if we think about the problem of climate change, it is a collective problem. It's also a collective action problem, but it's also an issue upon which there is, while there is scientific consensus about the nature of the problem, the physical nature of the problem, there is virtually no agreement on what should be done about it. And those disagreements aren't just about, national interest or material interests, but they're also about, ideological and ethical commitments. They're about the way that people see the world, the values that people hold most dear, the ideas about whose lives matter and whose don't, but also the ways that people imagine or anticipate the future. So we could certainly spend several hours just naming all the crises that we're dealing with, both present problems, but also the aftermath of historical crises. But that would be very depressing. So let's not do that. But we can think of what some of the big things are: climate change, global inequality, pandemics becoming much more problematic, increasing distrust between certain parts of the world, the rise of authoritarianism, and the list could go on. But what I want to point to here, and this is drawing on the work of Simon Cottle, who has a wonderful recent edited book called Worlds in Crisis. He argues that a big part of this global present, the contemporary condition that we're all struggling to get our heads around, is that we've failed to recognize that we are struggling with a failure of imagination. So while we search for definitive solutions, technical solutions, we also have in doing so, we've failed to cultivate the capacity to see the world differently or to imagine differently. So if we think about the imagination, it's hard to define, it's hard to pin down, but we might think about imagination as the capacity to envisage a world that does not appear before us. Right? That might be, imagining what I'm going to have for dinner tonight, or what I'd like to have for dinner tonight. It might be imagining where I'd like to be living, or the kind of life that I'd like to live. It might be imagining a whole new society, thinking about what, Bandung looks like in 2100, whatever it might be. But it really is about separating ourselves from the empirical realities of the world, the things that we can see and touch and feel, from other, less material things. And so that failure of imagination also means that we have lost the ability to, and this is a very simple way of describing it, probably not the most accurate, but we fail to be able to put ourselves in other people's shoes, to be able to consider perspectives that are outside of our own knowledge frameworks, our own cultural frameworks. And so for Cottle, if we don't address this failure of imagination, then we are going to not have the resources to be able to find effective responses or effective solutions to these collective problems caused by large-scale crises. Next slide, please. So just to recap very briefly, spoke about the challenge of intercultural communication and its relationship to what I call siloed thinking. Then we just now spoke about the failure of imagination, the failure to be able to think creatively about the things that we can't see in front of us. So here I want to introduce a different way of thinking about the world. So one dominant example is one dominant example of siloed thinking is what I was describing before about modernization theories, this idea that we can understand development as social change exclusively through the lens of the nation. Now, what I'm saying here does not minimize the importance of nations and nationalism as a productive and generative and positive force in our world, but it just points to the blind spots of approaching social, environmental, and ecological concerns only through the lens of the nation state, the territorial nation state. Because if we assume that as our intellectual framework, our methodological framework, then we are going to miss things that aren't neatly contained within those frameworks. And intercultural difference is one of them, right? But others might be, complex cross-border relationships that come about through migration or through trade, social and environmental relations that, don't fit easily into boxes. Complex weather systems, right? These are all transboundary problems that we can't pin down and put in that national box. So in addition to thinking about, the nation, I think we can also think really productively about the region, not just the region as a kind of assemblage or a collection of nations, but a region as a way of imagining the world that is much more open to relations, much more open to the dynamism and movement that makes up our world. And the challenge then is to think creatively about how we can keep those two ideas about our world, the nation that we all belong to. We're all national creatures, or most of us are national creatures, but also that other political geography that swirls around us, right? Now we can think about that relationship between the closed and the open, not just at the level of international relations, but we might also think about it in relation to other scales. For example, the relationship between the city and the hinterland, the relationship between land and sea, or sky, the relationship between home and the place away from home. Just was. All right, I'm going to race through to the end here because I know I've been talking like a professor. So, if we go to the next slide, please. So, I just want to use this example as the last thing I'll say today before we open up the discussion, to have a think about how some of these problems play out in your world, right? So you're all invested in or working in energy and mining and natural resources. Now, you may have heard of this example some years ago, 5 years ago, where the mining giant Rio Tinto, which is a really important global company, um, uh, destroyed an important site of Aboriginal cultural heritage in the Pilbara region. There's a lot of been written about this example, which you can look at in on the internet. But I just wanted to point out a couple of really important things. The first is that um, the this destruction, which was caused by explosives, was in part due to a lack of regard for Aboriginal cultural heritage. These sites, important shelter sites, rock art sites, which have been there for many, many thousands of years, um, and are deeply significant to the local Indigenous peoples, are not regarded as such by companies that extract and exploit these environments. The governance and political and legal system in Australia fails to protect such heritage, in part because it doesn't assume or recognise the value of these environments. The the episode, which was deeply traumatic for local traditional owners and has had significant ongoing effects, also points to the need to embed much more intercultural communication within the processes through which mining, exploration, and mining itself actually works. Any forms of environmental change and any forms of energy production, commodity production require sacrifices and trade-offs with, these economic decisions. But the fact that Aboriginal culture is so easily destroyed in this part in Australia is because its value has been completely misrecognized or unrecognized. Right? It's written out of the national story. So, with attention to thinking about intercultural communication as being open to the totality of ways of thinking across difference between, you know, settler society, corporate society, and Indigenous people, we can imagine maybe a different set of outcomes, a different set of governing systems where mining occurs in a much more consensual and holistic way that doesn't disregard or exclude those people who have had a much longer relationship to that environment. And these sorts of issues are playing out all over the world time and time again when it comes to the future of natural resource production. We can go back a few more years and look at the Dakota Access Pipeline, Keystone XL, think about how that relied on the dispossession of Indigenous people. We can look at, renewable energy. And I noticed in the opening video the tremendous renewable projects that are happening here in Indonesia and similar to Australia. Those also come with intercultural communication challenges that aren't just about saying, well, this is what we want to do and this is how we're going to do it, but also trying to come to some mutual understanding about what that energy transition should look like. And so that requires a much more open perspective on communication rather than just banal forms of consultation or just public relations. Anyway, so I'll leave it there and invite questions. But thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Samir Suleiman. It's a very insightful presentation. I feel like my own personal beliefs of like development has been quite challenged. You know, it really made me think about just how we do development a lot differently, because for a long time we've been, you know, narrowed down in very, in a way, economical standpoint, right? We focus on GDP, we focus on growth in a certain metric. But, you know, your presentation shows that there's room for other forms of development in that area, and that is explored through intercultural communications. All right. So that was very insightful for me, and I hope that everyone also get the same sense of, you know, how beneficial it is for us. I'll offer to the audience. Does anyone have any questions? Yes. There's one. I'll open to 2 sessions. Each session will be 3 questions. And the best 3 questions, and you have to choose which are the best ones, will get a prize from the committee. So, the floor is yours.
Yes.
Yes,
Yes, that's. Thank you, Arinta and Professor Samit, for the time and for the opportunity. My name is Denny. I work here. So I work as a staff in the training and development. I think I'd like to focus on the practical thing, simple thing. I want to talking about intercultural communication in real life. For example, if you go to the airport, right? We go to the lobby, to the waiting room, and there is someone sitting in front of you. You don't know what to say, for example. Oh, I don't know how, I want to open the communication with that person, but I don't know how to start. How to open up the channel of communication with someone I don't know in the waiting rooms. So my question is, in that simple situation, what are the best strategies, or what are the best or the most effective ways to start communication with someone we don't know in front of you? Because I want to talk to him.
Yeah.
I want to have a chit chat with him so we can communicate effectively with someone that I'd like to share with him. So I need your advice.
Yeah.
Because I heard a lot of strategies from YouTube, from journals, but I need to listen from you how to have effective ways to bridge, to have a kind, smooth conversation with someone I don't know. Let's say in the waiting room of the lobby. That's the first question, Mr. Sen. And the second question is that I think in communication we face barriers, right? Barriers, noise, language, or maybe anything with barriers. In your experience, what are the most difficult barriers when we have a kind of communication among different cultures? Because I think we meet a lot of barriers, especially when you talk with someone from Spain, Argentina, or maybe Aborigine, for example.
Yes.
So what are the most difficult barriers that we encounter when we want to talk about with someone among different cultures? Yes, thank you, Arinta and Professor, for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you, Pat. All right. We'll take note of that first question. Does anyone from the offline audience have any more questions? If not, I'll switch to the online questions. I think we have a couple here. I'll go start from the top. Okay, it's very small, sorry, but how does public officials' perception of cultural diversity influence policy formulation and implementation in multicultural regions? That's very lofty.
Great question.
Very great question. And then the third one, I'll offer again to offline. Oh, we have one. All right.
Thank you very much, Professor Sami, for the inspiring presentation. My name is Raini from PPSDM Aparatur. Let's begin with my question related to public service and intercultural communication. Professor, we are living in an era where digital global crises such as pandemic, climate change, and conflict affect every aspect of our lives. And the question is, what can government and institution learn from recent global crisis to strengthen cross-cultural resilience and cooperation. Okay, thank you.
Thank you for the questions. Wonderful.
Right?
I'll go in reverse order if that's
All
okay.
right.
Yes. So what institutions can do, I think, concretely is be open to incorporating different ways of knowing into the decision making. So thinking about bodies of knowledge to inform the success of a particular policy we might undertake, a form of monitoring and evaluation which uses particular metrics, has certain methods that are used. Now, what happens if we bring those into conversation with different ways of knowing? So it might be oral testimony from affected stakeholders. It might be forms of ethnographic knowledge which come to do with spending time with communities rather than just trying to take a snapshot. So I think that would require a very different economy of expertise and a different way of organising evidence and knowledge. But I think that we'll always struggle to accommodate everyone if we rely exclusively on narrow ways of knowing the world. You know, there are examples of institutions that do try and do this to, you know, not always successfully, but it's quite important to see those innovations. So we can look at, for example, some work that's done by the International Organization for Migration, which is a UN agency dealing with migration. And in some of their work, particularly the work on climate change in the Pacific, they're very attentive to the cultural knowledge that informs the way that Pacific Islands people perceive climate change, but also adapt to climate change. As one example. Now that's a public, you know, international institution that's trying to bring in diverse perspectives. So yeah, that would be one suggestion. Remind me the second question online. So I can't see that. I'm too old.
How does public officials' perception of cultural diversity influence policy formulation and implementation in multicultural regions?
Great, excellent. So one thing I was going to talk about today, but I until I started talking for too long, was some work that was done by my dear colleague, Professor Debbie Bargali, back at Griffith University. And she was the lead author on a study that was done for the Victorian government in Australia, the state government. The study looked at the experiences of Aboriginal women serving in the Victorian public service. Now, Victoria is a very multicultural community, a very multicultural population, particularly in those areas where public services are based, you know, the metropolitan areas primarily. What she was interested, what they were commissioned to do was trying to understand how Indigenous women experience their careers, what barriers they face to career development, and so on. And what they found was that recognition of diversity without understanding, or at least the attempt to understand by managers, led to really bad outcomes for women, Aboriginal women who are working in the public service, because the recognition without understanding, or, you know, acknowledgement of diversity without understanding, meant that managers were asking these women, who were the vast minority of employees, a very small percentage of that public service, had to do the vast majority of cultural labour, right? To make themselves count as Aboriginal people. There were also problems that they reported around cultural misinterpretations about things like humour. So the things that a senior manager might find funny, an Aboriginal person would find insulting. Yeah, and these are very like simple, everyday forms of communication across difference that fail to account for the worldviews that sit behind the encounter. So I think when it comes to managers in public service and thinking about how we accommodate difference in a hierarchical organisation, we do need to acknowledge that it's not just enough to acknowledge diversity, but to always strive to incorporate diverse thinking into our practices, right? To try and always imagine what it's like to be someone from perhaps a minority perspective or a minority background working within a majority employment context. To do that requires the ability to imagine, but it also requires some work to try and better understand some of the cultural values and norms and aspirations of various people working within that complex institution. So yeah, that's probably one small answer to what would be a much larger discussion. Now, the first question, practical examples. Look, the smokers in the room will know that there is a certain ritual about sneaking away to meet new friends and finding that icebreaker to try and communicate across difference. And it's a very difficult thing. And look, it's going to work differently for different people because it's not just about the cultural differences, it's also about the personal differences. Some of us are very shy. Some of us don't like to talk to strangers. Some of us feel very comfortable, making a joke or smiling at someone as a way to establish a connection. And so for me, and I can only speak for myself, but I find that, and it doesn't always work, but I find that trying to connect with someone, usually a stranger, across cultural differences, it's trying to find something in our encounter, our meeting, that we can both relate to, and we might relate differently. So, and again, and this is, I hope my employers aren't watching this because this is a terrible example, but the age-old ritual of meeting over a cigarette somewhere, it's a terrible, terrible habit, but it's an icebreaker. It's something that connects people. That experience connects people, and so finding that, and it might be a shared moment of humor about something that's happening around you. It might even be using your own cultural resources to reach across different. So as an Australian, that in itself, it has a certain cultural resonance in many parts of the world. So I can, say, "G'day, mate," and that opens up a channel of communication. It might be, noticing a decorative part of their. So, for example, if we met in a hotel lobby, I'd notice your uniform, and I would say, "Oh, that's the Indonesian flag. Are you a part of the public service?" And just using that little moment of connection in that encounter to open up. But then the other thing I would always suggest and try to do myself is ask questions. The thing I tried to do most when I was becoming an academic, when I was doing my PhD, wasn't doing my PhD, well, that was hard. The thing that I was most proud of myself in being able to do was the art of asking questions, right? So to being in an encounter and then being able to find a question that would open up something, spark the imagination of the other person, and using those ways in to then build and build and build. So look, there isn't a simple answer, but I think it's just being open to and being inquisitive about difference. But, yeah.
All right, thank you very much. I think for time, we have either one more question I'll offer to the offline audience if there are any, but I have one question from an audience that I would like to ask because
Please.
I'm the moderator. It's my choice, and I work in renewables. So I want to ask regarding, oh, I'm sorry. She has rights.
Sure.
Go
Please.
ahead. And from the mic.
I think in intercultural communication is no longer a choice, yeah, but it is a necessity. But how to keep the good intercultural communication in the different culture and how to keep the region stability.
Mm. Great question.
Yeah.
Great question. I think it's many of these issues are context dependent. But if we think about, and here I'm speaking outside of my area of expertise, but if we think about, issues of safety in the mining sector or in any industrial sector, that the systems and practices and rules that keep people safe, they also have a really strong cultural component. I have a colleague at Griffith whose name is Sydney Decker, and he's a safety science researcher. And his great contribution is showing that culture matters in successful safety systems. So safety, again, is something that we might think to be a technical issue that we just put into an organization, but safety also requires a constant open negotiation and translation of different ideas, different values, different ways of sensing the world, ways of making sense of the world, that always need to be nourished, need to be paid attention to. So I guess the answer then is that how do we find stability? We find stability by not just treating intercultural communication as the one event, but then constantly pay attention to it, because cultures and relationships always change. They are always dynamic. And to be able to keep open those lines of communication particularly in organizational settings, which have really well-defined structures and processes. So it's being open to openness and using that as a resource to, it's like if you're on a boat, right? The boat's rocking. If you stand still, you're going to fall over. You kind of need to move with it. And I think that's a similar way. Always be open to that changing dynamic.
All right, thank you very much. I think we're up for time, unfortunately, but I know your contacts are all online. You're in Griffith University, and I encourage everyone to want to ask questions, ask directly to Professor Samit Sulaiman. So thank you very much for your session today. I hope it's as beneficial as for me and everyone else. A round of applause for him. All right, I think that rounds up our session. Alhamdulillah, we had 389
Wow.
participants in the webinar. So I think it's a success.
Thank you all for online and here for participating. It's been wonderful.
It's for the community as well. All right. Thank you very much, everyone, for the insightful questions, for also, of course, Professor Samit Sulaiman for making time with us today. I hope we all get something out of it today. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Samid, for the insightful lecture. And thank you, Ms. Arinta, for leading the session as our moderator. Please give a round of applause to our speaker and moderator. Professor Samid and Ms. Arinta, you may leave the stage and please proceed. Professor Samid, we are honored to host you today. We will give you a memento, a token of our gratitude and symbol of our continuous collaboration. I would like to invite you to receive the memento. Uh, On behalf of PPSD Maparatur, we extend our sincere gratitude to Professor Samid Suliman, Ms. Arinta, Ibu Irma, and the team from Griffith University, and to all participants for contributing to today's event. We hope the insights shared today will be a strong first step to future initiatives, strengthen partnerships, and inspire continued dialogue. Thank you all for your presence and active participation. We wish you a pleasant afternoon. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.